A very good morning to all who are joining us in this 60-minute webinar today as participants and viewers. This is Sally Chiu from Temasek Polytechnic, bringing you the fifth in the series of bi-monthly live webinars brought to you jointly by the Singapore Training and Development Association, better known as STADA here in Singapore, and the Center for Transcultural Studies at Temasek Polytechnic. The last live webinar, we had Kimo Kippen, Chief Learning Officer from Hilton Worldwide, and Michelle Rigolizzo from Learning Innovations Lab from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and they shared with us empowering learning at work and training for the rapid changing future, to expect the unexpected and to prepare for the unknown. This morning, we are so delighted to have with us Dr. Victoria Marsick, Professor, Adult Learning and Leadership at the Columbia University. Victoria holds a PhD in Adult Education from the University at Columbia Teachers College. She holds a PhD in Adult Education from University of California, Berkeley, and an MPA in International Public Administration from the Syracuse University. She has worked extensively in Asia and other countries with both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, and she directs staff development prior to joining the faculty at Teachers College in Columbia. Besides that, Victoria also co-directs with Martha Gappert at the J.M. Huber Institute for Learning in Organizations, dedicated to advancing the state of knowledge and practice for learning and change in organizations. She's also a founding member of Partners for Learning and Leadership, a group that works with organizations to design, develop, and implement action learning and other strategic learning interventions. And she is faculty and coach in the Cairns Fellows Program at Teachers College for Distinguished Public Schools Principals. She has written extensively on informal learning, action learning, team learning, and organizational learning culture. There's so much to talk about, Victoria. Viewers, while the session is on, you can post your questions on STADA's Facebook so that we can bring them into this web of learning. And if we can't do that during the live seminar, we sure can address them after the live webinar as well. Victoria is what we call today a scholar practitioner who works both with academia and industry. As she has so much to share with us today, I would like to hand over the session to her right now. She will be presenting the session in 3 segments so that participants can come on with their questions and contributions. Over, Victoria, to you for segment 1.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try this. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Are they available?
Yes.
The slides are on. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. You let me know if you can see what's on the slides, because it's hard for me to see them. They're very tiny and in the corner for me. But I want to share with you, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate being in touch with you there in the warm Singapore when we're in the cold New York right now. And this morning for you, I'm interested in sharing a little bit about why people seem to be so interested in collective learning these days in organizations. And then I'm going to share with you ways of thinking about what collective learning is, starting with the dynamics of informal learning using relationships, which really are at the heart of collective learning, and then talking about a group or team learning model that I and other people have developed and use in our research and in our practice. And the third part of the seminar would be on how culture affects collective learning, some insights that some of my students have gained from looking at cross-cultural dimensions of team learning and group learning. So just very quickly, I'm sure you all have a good idea of why tap into collective learning, or you wouldn't probably be here on the call. But we live in what the U.S. military a number of years ago started calling a VUCA world, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so the solutions from yesterday don't really work today. They frequently require together new ways of interacting with people who we otherwise might not have interacted with. So we have multiple partnerships across disciplinary boundaries, across organizational boundaries, across cultural boundaries, and we have realized that we don't know enough about the solutions in and of ourselves. So it's not just what we know, but it's also what they know, what other people know. So how do we tap into what other people know and really utilize it in the organization? Because patterns that worked in the past often don't fit today, and there are these escalating conditions that make it very difficult to learn individually or collectively. We all know very much that there's scarce time. Time is pressing on us all the time, and technology, while it gives us many new pieces of information, it also speeds things up, and it makes us have to come to decisions very quickly, which sometimes takes the time out away from us that we might otherwise have used to kind of think things over and talk things over with other folks. And then finally, of course, culture itself makes a big difference in the world's global teams. Most business industries work across cultures and across global time zones. And in Singapore, I know that you work across cultural boundaries all the time, even if you're in the same time zone. So these are considerations when we think about team learning that we'd like to talk about today. So very briefly, I'm going to start with what I have found to be at the heart of team learning, because team learning and group learning, collective learning if you would, all that means is that people are learning not just on their own or individually, but they're collaborating with other people as they're learning, so that what they put together is not just my product, but it's our products. The thing that's very interesting is that it usually arises out of challenges that we face in the environment. And so we may be going about our business, and all of a sudden something doesn't work the way it should. People get distracted or don't respond in the way that we expect, or we are attempting to put something into play and we don't get the results that we want. And so there's a bit of a surprise. And when we pay attention to that surprise, then we have an opportunity to really rethink what is really going on in this situation. It might not take a lot of time to do that, because unconsciously our minds are going back to the past experiences that we've had, and we look for patterns rather unconsciously. And when we have an opportunity to stop and look a little bit more carefully for patterns, we may take into consideration things we didn't see at first. You know, things about the different cultural norms or values of other people in our group, for example. The political considerations with a small p that might be going on in our interactions with people in the organization. Things of that sort, as well as new legislation, new rules, new policies. So we need to think of a lot of things in a very short period of time. And then when we are able to do that, we find some new solutions, we experiment with them, we get feedback, and we adjust what we do if we get some good feedback. The collective dimension of learning comes into play at each of these steps. When there is a jolt or surprise, we might find that other people are also somewhat surprised. We can check in with other people to find out what they're thinking about the situation. And by talking with other people and working together, we can avoid many of what we would call blind spots. Our beliefs, what happened to us in the past, cause us to think about things in certain ways, so we may exclude other important information that would otherwise help us to get a better understanding of what really is going on and how we could respond to it. And then, of course, there's the opportunity to have consultation with people about, well, what did you do? How did you solve that problem? What solutions would you come up with? And then finally, and probably very importantly, we often don't understand exactly what's going to happen as a result of what we do. And so by talking to other people as we go through experiences, we can find out, well, when I did this in the past, this is what happened, or that is what happened. So we through collective learning, whether we're mostly getting that information because we ourselves need to do something differently, or if we're working with other people in pairs or in groups, we're able to really get so much more out of our understanding of the situation and so much more out of the possible ways in which we can address it. So so that leads us to really see that this learning that we do in organizations is very social. We're not just individuals who are going about learning kind of in little contexts and silos on our own. Jay Cross, who does a lot of work in this area, he says we really have outgrown the definition of learning as the activity of an individual. And in some ways, we've moved back to what used to be in the very early days of workplace learning, an apprentice model where people would learn from and with other people. But now with technology and with other kinds of aids, it's at a much higher level. So I think many of you are probably aware that there's this movement towards leveraging the informal learning that people engage in organizations. And we know that we can't do that in the same way that we can do if we are doing training courses. And so what does that mean, and how can we understand it if we're tapping into collective learning? I want to share one example which at first seems simple, and it's probably an example that hopefully is not something that any of us on the call engage in on a regular basis, because it has to do with emergency medical technicians or paramedics who are called to the scene when there's an accident or when when somebody gets sick and needs help immediately in their home, etc. And one of my students did a very interesting study of paramedics, and she found that paramedics really mostly learned in this way, as I described to you, from experience. They had training in the organization, but they found that the training was never, they never got trained just at the moment when they needed the help. Whereas if when they learned from their experience about making calls and solving difficult challenges, it was never boring, and they always learned so much more. And in fact, the reason why this is so interesting for collective learning is because paramedics always work in partnerships. When they go out on calls, there are two people on the call, and they told my student, as she was studying it, that 1 + 1, which would normally be 2 in a partnership, could be either 2, but it could also be less than 2 or more than 2, depending on how people were or were not able to capitalize on what one another knew in the process of working together. So the working and learning together became very important. An example that I like, because it is so very graphic, they said, you know, one paramedic pair talked about the fact that, and we pulled up that day and we knew we were in trouble because there was a truck halfway on top of a car and the car was hanging over the bridge. And they had never seen anything like that before. And the way they the way they learned about how to solve this problem was very much like the cycle I just described. They even though they were in the middle of a very difficult situation, they stopped. They said, okay, here are the different things we can do. What do we know won't work? And what can we try? And how should we do it? And then they would try something. Then they would stop and say, okay, what happened now? Now what should we do next? What won't work? What will work? And so through the whole call, they were, in fact, going through this stop and think, stop and think, stop and think. So they graphically demonstrated the way they learned together. And they talked about the fact that they happened to be a pair that were very synergistic. And so they actually learned in the moment. They were able to tap into one another's knowledge in ways that are not always possible. They said that relationships matter enormously in the way in which they can leverage one another's thinking, because they get to know one another so well. They know how they think, and they're willing to say things and to put things out on the table that they might otherwise be a little nervous about sharing. For example, none of us like to look foolish or to look like we've made a mistake. But when you're in situations where we don't both of us have the answers, we have to do that somewhat in order to be able to get the best information out and make the best decisions. So this sharing of knowledge informally and talking with one another ended up being really the best way of tapping into collective learning. And in fact, paramedics, when they hung around and they were retooling their vans because they had to put new supplies in them, fill out timesheets, things of that sort, they would meet with other paramedic teams and they would share the stories of what they had just been through. And they said, you know, well, you run a call once, but physically, but you run the call dozens of times after that, over and over, and telling the story to other people. And it comes back to you and you think about it. So at the heart of their informal learning was this paired sharing learning. And this is very supported by research. There are a number of people who have looked at the kind of learning that goes on in organizations that's very meaningful to people, and most of it happens with other people, in group activities, working alongside other people, tackling challenging tasks together, and often working with clients who bring a totally different view into the thinking of a group of people working in an organization. So in fact, a number of people have found that the availability of people at the moment of learning and problem solving is far more important than anything else. In other words, it's great if you have a coach or an expert or a mentor that you can go to, but often that person is not available in the moment. And it's in the moment to have someone with whom you can consult, who can really think together with you about things in an open and honest and in an informed way. Makes all the difference in the world. And so that kind of dynamic process is, in fact, at the heart of collective learning. And with that, I'm going to stop with this first segment and kind of tap into your collective learning about times that you have found yourself maybe in pairs or in small groups with people, and ask, what questions might you have about this idea of how it is that informal learning happens in and through relationship, in small groups and in pairs.
And now,
Sally?
Participants, over to you. If you have a question and a contribution, please raise your hand so that we can direct the microphone to you. Chandru from Singapore, and from IQ, HR practitioner, go.
Hi, I'm from the corporate world, and I relate everything to what need to happen for corporate performance. So one of the things that I have seen and experienced is we encourage building a learning culture in the organization, and our budgets are more towards how we encourage collective learning process than classroom learning process. What do you see as a global practice from your experience?
Do you mean what global practices are people using in order to leverage this informal learning?
That's right.
Yes. I think
if I may, from a corporate perspective, not just from an educational institution perspective.
Yes. All of this research that I'm sharing with you in many ways comes from corporate or organizational perspectives, not necessarily from an educational perspective. But I've looked a lot at the research in all different settings, including corporate settings, and talked with people who are trying to support this notion of informal learning. And one of the keys to success seems to be working with the manager, because the manager is the person who has the most influence over people in their work group. And so those people are often folks who they have never really been supported in being very effective at knowing what to do to coach their people or to help them to create an environment, for example, in a team meeting where people can effectively work together or share knowledge together while they're working together. And so I know this is a kind of a solution that people say, well, yes, of course it's true, and what do we do about it? And it differs somewhat in each organization. Okay. Excuse me, seems like I'm having trouble with my voice here, but can you hear me now?
Very well now.
Okay, thank you. I don't quite know what was going on, but I was attempting to answer the gentleman who asked the question about what corporate solutions are in relationship to performance. And I think the question is the answer is in providing tools and support and skills to managers who can really be more effective in supporting that learning in groups.
Thank you, Chandru, for that first question. Is there anybody else? Anyone? Heather?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can
I
hear
can
you.
hear you.
Great. I thought that was really interesting what you just said about the availability of people at the moment of learning is what's really important, because I am that external coach or mentor who comes in to coach and meet with people outside of that moment. So I'm wondering if there are ways for us as coaches and trainers to create these informal experiences in our training programs. Is there any data showing, you know, whether case studies and creating certain challenges for the group, if it creates the learning at the same level as the informal learning, even though it's kind of pretend informal, it's still structured? Or can we not really achieve that level as an external person?
Excuse me. I seem to have a frog in my throat here. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are many things that you can do. I've been working with a group called Achieve Global, and one of the things that they have been looking at is how can they align what they do in training so that they can better support informal learning back on the job. And so as part of their needs assessment and as part of their looking at how it is that people are working in their natural environments, they identify informal learning opportunities for people, and they bring them into the training situations, and they create tools that people can take back to better support their work in that vein. You know, so for example, a very simple one is probably many of you have run into like learning reviews. And learning reviews, of course, can be very artificial, but they also are very effective, and in different organizations they're carried out in different ways. So doing those within the training environment and then enabling people to have the support that they need when they go outside of the training environment, you know, helps a lot in that regard. There's one other thing I'd like to mention in that vein, and that is there has been there has been some work that would show that if you want people to pick up and sharpen their skills in pattern recognition, which is a very important kind of key to this kind of learning, because when we face a situation, we often do the things that were working for us in the past without much thought given to it, and that's good in a way, because we have a kind of an unconscious expertise in this area. But in various training modalities, especially in the area of conflict resolution, they have been, instead of doing one case, they do multiple cases, and they sharpen people's skills in being able to diagnose more effectively what is really going on in this situation. Because oftentimes we you know, because we're so concerned with getting an answer quickly, we may get the wrong answer because we haven't taken that extra second, you know, to figure out what really is going on here in this situation. So that is definitely another thing that you can do in training to enhance people's capabilities on the job.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Heather Hansen, our global corporate comms. I think we want to move on and let Victoria continue with the second segment on group team learning, especially in organizations. As we see today, increasingly reliance on companies in collective learning and knowledge generated when employees work together. How then can organizations encourage and create working supportive environments to grow this culture? Over to you, Victoria.
Okay, all right. You probably may know that there are a couple people who've been doing a lot of work in the area of group and team learning. Some practical ways in which this is being done, and where a lot of looking is being done, is in the use of tools called action learning. And I do a lot of that work myself. So action learning is kind of a supported environment in which when people work on real challenges, they also have a coach in the moment to not so much to give them expertise about the content, but to help them be more conscious of their own skills and abilities in setting up a good work process and environment, and in doing the maximum that they can to get the most out of that moment. And so that's one area where a lot of work is being going on to understand how to improve group and team learning. As an example, what I would like to share with you a bit is where some of the focus needs to be in improving capabilities in team learning. And these insights that I'm sharing with you come from, in part, some studies that have been done in several corporations, two of them that I did intensively, one in a large petroleum company, and the second in a smaller IT group, in a technology group that was moving to self-managed teams and that was trying to figure out better how they could develop the capabilities to manage themselves. But these studies are being done by a number of people in a lot of environments. There is a work being done on this up at Harvard, also often in the healthcare environment. And it partly hinges on the question of people are more likely, is whether you're really working with a group, and in that group, if people have disparate goals, in other words, if you have people who are, each of whom is helping one another work on their own goals, then it's a little harder to leverage collective learning. Although we do know now, through all of the work that's being done on communities of practice, that there are many times and places where if we have shared interests and the conditions are right, and we get the right kind of thought leadership and space to do this work, people can make big breakthroughs on their own in helping one another on products and improved products and services and things of that sort. But one of the key differences is to think about as you're trying to figure out are you going to be able to get this leverage is whether or not there really is this shared set of performance goals, whether there really is co-ownership of outcomes and collective work products. There are many groups of people who come together who need to be together for various reasons, but whose goals just aren't mutual enough to be able to make that work. So what I'm talking about here in particular is where there is this shared kind of idea of what we need to do together. One of the things that's interesting when you think about the difference between teamwork and team learning is, you know, is it enough if we've got people who are able to work well together, which in itself, as we all know, is not such an easy thing to do. We all have to go through the steps of forming, norming, storming before we get to performing as groups. But even if we do have good group dynamics, good group process, we don't necessarily have a team that is really going to learn together. They may, in fact, get the job done, but if you're looking for extra benefits, for example, innovation in that team, it'll be harder for them to do it because the conditions may or may not exist for them to share knowledge together. And that's what we're really looking for in team learning. A metaphor that you might think about is when different colored lights are brought together, that the color in and of itself, in this case the green light, the red light, or the blue light, are additive when they come together, and so different color combinations are possible. So you might contrast it if, for those of you who kind of keep in mind the notion of kind of pouring those colors together and creating something totally new, versus, for example, across a quilt that's made together with many different patches, and you just work with whatever patches you might have, and so the patterns are there, but they may not be as purely melded as you do when you have really good group learning. When you have groups that are learning that well, then everybody in the team can perceive themselves as having contributed to the outcome, and everybody in some way can individually describe what the team as a system learns and knows. So our studies were trying to ferret out the conditions and understand what are the steps along that way. And we were able to see situations and conditions where individuals might be learning very effectively in the group and the group might get their work done. And we called that fragmented learning. And then you could get more leverage when you have pooled learning. That is, that several people in the group might be very effective together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the group as a whole takes advantage or can get access to what those pools of people actually know and learn together. And I'll show you some examples when it comes to the discussion in the third section on cross-cultural conditions that I think reflect that notion of pooled learning that is very good for some individuals but not necessarily for the team as a whole. And then finally there is what we call synergistic learning, where everybody is really able to work very, very closely together and get much better kinds of outcomes. And so we were able, we have developed a team learning survey instrument, and we use it with teams in order to be able for teams to track how is it that we're working together. And I'm going to share with you some of the kinds of dynamics that we in particular look at, but we look at learning dynamics, and we also look at conditions that affect that learning, because there are some ways that if certain things are present or absent, it's going to accelerate or decelerate that learning. So when things are going well, you have a lot of changes in outcomes, and you have outcomes of the group, but you also have changes in the way in which the group work together. They become more innovative as they work together. Just because the group is learning doesn't necessarily mean that the learning that they have in that team is necessarily used to improve the organization as a whole. And I'm not going to get into a lot of that detail this evening, although we can talk more about it if you're interested, because we've also looked at what are the barriers and the supports for really taking that learning and leveraging it much more fully in the organization. And often they are things like managerial support for the particular kind of outcome that we're looking for. For example, we did some studies in a global manufacturing company that was trying to improve networking, and we were able to identify the 5 or 6 things that managers did that really made a statistical difference in terms of the productivity of those teams, and that was used then by the organization to really get a lot more benefit from their networking processes in the organization. But where we look especially in team learning is when the group is getting together, it's this whole question of how effectively can they think together. And together is the operative word. So if we think back to that informal learning cycle that I talked about earlier, we all go into a group situation and we have an idea of what is going on, but we need to be able to step back. I think Robert is not on the call right now, but Robert's participation in Lila this year is all about unlearning. And oftentimes in groups, to get the most out of a group, you have to step back a little bit from what you think you know and be open to hearing other perspectives on what is going on. We actually know a lot about how that kind of information needs to be presented to really be heard. And we can't go into all of that here, but there is a lot of knowledge about how to present your point of view in such a way that you present enough evidence for it and advocate, but you are also open to inquiring into what other people think so that new perspectives can be formed together out of those integrated views. And then there are 2 forms of acting that really accelerate the way teams learn, and one of them is getting information by crossing boundaries. It is quite interesting how there's a group called the Lectical Assessment System that measures certain kinds of behaviors that enable people to act more complexly in difficult and challenging circumstances. And 2 of them that really come up frequently are asking for more information of a wider range of stakeholders and being able to take different perspectives on the situation. And then the third that they have measured that pertains here too is the ability to collaborate across boundaries. And then of course being able to pay attention to how we help groups experiment with their solutions so that they can not only try new things out but also be very aware of how to check whether things are in fact going in the direction that they wish it to be, and being able to gather the kind of information that they need to change and acting are really critical pieces. I have just these 2 small examples from this cross-cultural study that I'm going to share in this 3rd section coming up, and I thought they illustrate some aspects of this notion of thinking and acting together. This example comes from Emergency Operations Group in a humane organization that works in emergencies. For example, you can see this would be happening a lot, I'm sure, right now in the Philippines after the typhoon, because people come from all over, many different cultures, many different backgrounds, etc., but they have a very clear idea of what needs to happen to improve what's going on in that country right now and bring relief to it. And so these people talked about how they had to be able to put differences aside in their cultures and in the different ways that they understood the standards that they wanted to apply, talking together, working together in order to really enhance ideas and create a new way of doing things together. And the second example is one I think many of us probably come across all the time. There's many benefits in global organizations to have global training solutions. And actually, I think that's a critical best practice in some of the companies that I know where they're able to do that. But you do run into some really challenging difficulties because of the fact that there is no one way of thinking and learning together. And so this quote comes from a multinational organization in which the original materials for training were created in the United States, and the Japanese team members had to work with those people from the United States to adapt them to their country. And so while the benefits of streamlining and alignment across the whole organization had to be weighed against Japanese learning styles and languages, different time, costs, and resources, and different views about what would really work in that country. And so these are examples where by being able to bring out and leverage differences, the teams were able to make a lot of progress. So our team learning model pays attention to thinking and action and to how that gets us the results that we want, but it also looks at conditions within the team and within the organization that really are beneficial to team learning and organizational learning. And these are conditions on the slide are 5 of them that really stand out in research over many different organizational circumstances. Appreciation of teamwork, valuing it and being explicit about that, making sure that individuals really can speak out. And as we will see in the cross-cultural piece next, that becomes a very difficult kind of thing to have happen in many situations because power differences and particularly levels and hierarchies and things of that sort are differently interpreted in different cultures. And so even when individuals wish to express what their views are and are invited into the mix, it's often very difficult to be really clear about what they offer and to be completely open and being able to offer that to the group. And then, of course, certain operating principles, both for teamwork and for team learning. For example, in a global multinational company that had very strong ways of training people in how to run team meetings, fared a lot better than other organizations where the group norms for how you run meetings were not as clear, and so those things had to get negotiated when the group norms are not clear or when clear processes are not in place. And then at the organizational level, having really support for teams and being able to utilize what comes out of them in the organization and valuing the collaboration that can be gained by sharing different ideas across the organization. So that's my end of segment 2, Sally.
Thank you so much, Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
I am looking for responses. I see Jennifer from Ohio, Master Trainer DDI. You have joined the seminar, the webinar. What's the time over there?
Yep, I'm here.
Would you have a contribution or a question to this segment?
I don't right now, but thanks for asking.
Sure. Is there anybody else with a question and a contribution?
I have a question.
Thank you. Iris from Thailand, APM.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Regarding the team learning, I'm thinking about the team as a cross-functional team. Now, if this is a cross-functional team, you have people with different stakeholders, different issues, and many times it's very difficult for them to actually agree on a shared goal itself. In this case, when you have a cross-functional team, what would be the best way to get them to initiate and start the learning as a team? Like what kind of approaches would you use to help them start doing that?
Okay, that's a very good question. Excuse me. That's a very good question, and I think that question is also relevant sometimes when people are not necessarily across functions, but they have other deep differences that might make it difficult for them to communicate. For example, in some of my research in technology, high technology teams, people are using different platforms of technology or being involved in different software. They have very deep specialized knowledge in different areas, and that would be true in cross-functional teams as well. So there is a the idea you may have run into from Dorothy Leonard's work on innovation in particular, and she talks about having people on the team who have what she calls T skills, as in the letter T, as in Tom, and that means that you have people on the team. When you're putting the team together, you want to pay attention to having people who can help with the translation, people who have been who have worked in several different functions, for example, in the case of a cross-functional team, and know enough about some of the deep language within an area, as well as working, as well as being able to, so they are able to not only work in their own area, but they know enough about the areas of other people that they're able to create that translation effect, to be able to pull and bring information out from some of the other members of the team with respect to the task at hand. So I think here you also have the question of how closely do people need to work together in the cross-functional discussions and dialogues, because there may be more effective ways of gathering some of the information that's needed without necessarily being in team meetings, which is sometimes difficult and painful for people, and people just don't find it easy to communicate in that venue. So there may be other ways to pull information through technology or other kinds of ways, and then have a smaller group to be the integrating team to work on looking at that and raising questions back to people to try to help to take the work to the next level. Those are some ideas.
Thank you, Victoria. Do I see any responses?
I would have a question of people who are on the call. You know, it's a very interesting question about how do people who are out there, what are the challenges that you run into when you, we heard about the cross-functional teams. Are there other common challenges that you run into when you try to get teams to not only work at a minimum level, but really maximize their effectiveness by getting them to share knowledge together and to be innovative together? I'd be interested in some of the challenges that people are experiencing.
Heather? Heather, your question?
There we go. I couldn't unmute, sorry. I think it's probably going to come up in this next segment on cross-cultural, but I'm specializing in global English communication, and the challenges that I see the most are the judgments and impressions across cultures based on ability to communicate and express oneself well in English. Since that tends to be the cross-border language that's generally used. So that's the biggest, by far the biggest challenge that I have in my area of global communication.
And yes, it is definitely, excuse me, definitely one of the areas that are problematic in cross-cultural work. Sorry for my croaking voice. I seem to be losing my voice as I'm talking to all of you. But one of the things that in the cross-cultural section in that study that seemed to be they spent a lot of time on this question of how to really be able to get people's voice in the room when English was not their first language. And in fact, many of the barriers come when people can't do that because they feel ignored and they eventually simply drop out of the discussion in one way or another. So the things that seemed to work most effectively were, for example, there was one team leader who devised a method that after discussions were held in team meetings and ideas were always listed very explicitly. So one aid to trying to draw out meaning would be to use visual aids and various kinds of objects and visualization, documentation in different ways, because people often feel more comfortable when they have an opportunity to read and see things than when they only have to rely on language if English is not their first language. So that's one thing people often did. And I thought this one idea was really quite simple but effective. This team leader set a rule that after every meeting, once they wrote down what the decisions were that were made, they agreed upon a certain period of time that people could have 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it might be, within which they could come back and offer other perspectives or offer modifications to what was agreed to, etc. Because sometimes when language is a big issue in particular, people need more thinking time. They need time to digest it, and sometimes they also need to go off and talk to somebody who speaks their own language so that they can confer about those things. So those are some ideas from that study that were helpful.
Very good points. Thank you.
Chandru.
Well, I have had the privilege to work in all the continents in the world, and I manage large teams, regional and global. Actually two observations. One is clearly when we put together teams in one room, normally in Asian and African culture particularly, they don't speak up, even when they are spoken to or invited to. Now, I observed that there are two things there. One is the competitive nature of performance that seems to come in the way. And secondly, which I think is equally important, is all of us feel constantly being judged. So even in a team learning environment, there is this inherent belief and a perception that they're being judged for performance. So they hesitate to speak up even what they know, forget about what they have to ask. So I found that it takes a huge amount of my time to enable them to drop their guard, make themselves vulnerable before they really open up for learning, and actually take away the threat of performance assessment in that room so that it really becomes a learning environment. And that has been the challenge for organizations like where I have been in creating a learning culture.
I agree with you. Excuse me. I agree with you. That is very much so. And, it's not only true. I think it gets exaggerated and is more easy to see, and it's more tangible in the cross-cultural setup than it is in one culture. But I'll just to share the title of a book that I absolutely love that kind of reflects this. The title of the book is "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me." And it speaks to the judging nature that people feel constantly judged, and in fact many cultures do punish people when they make mistakes, which just perpetuates the notion that they are feeling judged. So I agree with you. One of the very interesting strategies a colleague of mine in an IT firm used with his cross-cultural work was a kind of a creative team which he called flow teams, which was built a little bit on design thinking principles, the IDEO kind of design thinking approach, as well as on Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. And they minimized the use of language, and they maximized the use of quick thinking, tapping into knowledge, metaphor. Everything that they did was always to be captured in multiple ways. So they might capture it through a picture or through a song title, or some other question, something other than only serious weighty language, if you would. So they use that, and I think some of you may have run into the use of the tool of drawing pictures of what's going on during meetings, so that capturing of things graphically is another really good tool. I think all of these things, what they serve to do is kind of take people out of everybody out of their normal comfort zone, and also give them additional senses that they can draw upon in working together. So I do agree it's a big challenge. You know, I'm sympathetic to that challenge. I understand exactly what you mean.
Thank you, Chandru, for the wonderful contribution, and Victoria. We are now down to our last 7 minutes for your final segment, and I think we should just go ahead.
Okay, and some of these things we've actually been talking about, because you're absolutely right. When culture comes in, when different cultures come in the room, then we see the challenges to working together in teams all the more vividly, because we do have so many different working preferences. Those are also true even within the same culture. We make assumptions that we share a lot more sometimes when we actually don't. But all of the studies that I've seen on good teamwork and good team learning do have to continually find ways to set ground rules and to make explicit things that otherwise would be sort of taken for granted ways of working, because each of the cultures brings such a different approach to what it is that how it is they go about doing their business. So you will recognize these big 5 cultural perceptions that matter, especially in teams, in this one particular study. And this study was based on people, about 20 people in a variety of corporate and not-for-profit organizations that Yoon Chang did. And so one area is this question of level of knowledge about international business practices. And I've seen this in particular in studies that are done on project-based learning, because projects have a whole language of their own and a number of different standards and rhythms to them, etc. And often, because the language is used across cultures, people think that it means the same thing across cultures. And then when, in fact, it doesn't, people stop short, and it really kind of makes it almost impossible to get work done on time and under budget, which is what everybody tries to do in a project. So, for example, all the values in the global training solution example that I gave earlier about the U.S. team to prioritize synchronization and global alignment, those are all good corporate multinational values. And yet there has to be some tension in local teams that need to adapt those in order to be able to get along and get the business going in their own area. So that question of how do you elicit the values on different sides, and what negotiations do you do to be able to make sure that everybody understands the business practices that are needed to get the work done in exactly the same way, even if they're not completely comfortable with that definition. So that's one big area that the dissertation spent a lot of time on unveiling. A second area was the one that you brought up, Heather, earlier, which had to do with language barriers. And there are many, many aspects of them, some of which you alluded to, the difficulties of just communicating, and the feeling of being left behind and not having your voice heard. And time and again, studies say that being heard is far more important than being acted upon. In other words, if you feel you're heard, even if the decision can't be made in your favor, you feel that you've participated in a better way than if you don't even feel like your voice has been understood. And then the questions that also come up around language about ambiguity of what it is that people mean by terms and how they understand things that are going on in one another's heads. There's also the interesting differences in how we ask questions and what it is that we hear when we get those answers. So in this particular second quote, saying you have to be very careful of what you say in some cultures, because if you ask for S, you will get exactly X, but you may not get the other things that you were hoping to get. And so these are things to kind of heighten sensitivity around in terms of language barriers. The third is interpersonal conflict, which I think is the bane of all teams. But it does, in fact, become even more challenging, I think, as Chandu, as you said, in the examples that you gave, because when that conflict exists, whether it's out-and-out hand-to-hand fistcuff conflict, or whether it's the varying of what it is that we're really thinking because we want to avoid conflict. It really makes it impossible to get the best out of global teams. We might be better off not having global teams if that were the case, because we can't actually cultivate the benefit of them. The fourth being a very key one around work styles and ways of thinking, and we do know that there are many big differences in how we approach things culturally. For example, the whole question of conflict resolution, and some cultures being much more comfortable with just directly approaching people about different ways of thinking, and for other cultures that is something that's completely rude. It even shows up in email etiquette differences, which are really key. So these are very, very important steps to iron out and to spend some time on and think about. And then, of course, time management, because we all have different views about what time means. And for example, my husband's view of time is that it's always 10 minutes late. If he were here on the phone, he would probably be unhappy about that, but it's true. So we all have different views of that, and it becomes really challenging when we're working cross-culturally and we haven't worked those things through. So just a couple of things that people did to work around this. There were people who frequently used retreats or small group meetings to talk through challenges that they weren't able to solve in the large group. Often, especially with many different cultures, people would approach other people, especially those who shared their culture, to talk about what went on in the meeting, to translate language, to validate ideas. And this was very helpful most of the time, although it could also create silos that made it difficult to access the thinking of other people. And then there were ways that people would go off and get coaching from someone to figure out how they could be more effective in the group. And then, of course, the idea that if we have more trust with people, we probably will have a better time unlocking what people think, because we have that relationship. And so social activities definitely do that. And then as I said earlier, although it can be cliche, the leader is the person to really leverage in this the most, because oftentimes leaders can get together and share the kinds of things that they do in the organization already that seem to work for them. Just that sharing with one another would enable some of the things that work in one team to be shared in other teams. And these are some of the things that a number of the leaders did. I mentioned a few examples as I went through this, but attending to ground rules and norms, surfacing cross-cultural sensitivities rather than letting them be buried in a tactful way so that we could understand them, finding different ways to ask questions and asking different kinds of questions, not only objective questions for facts, but also reflective questions to get at how people are feeling, or interpretive questions to get at how people are thinking in different ways about the topic that's being addressed. In addition, of course, to decisional questions. Talking with people outside of the meetings to clarify things, mediating conflict, and I mentioned the use of documentation, agendas, briefing documents, etc. Anything that can make tangible those things that otherwise would be taken for granted, around which we can have very poor communication. So, Sally, I think I probably should stop there, don't you?
I think so, except that you might want to just share your last model.
Okay.
The context. That's a good takeaway.
So this is my, this is really just kind of a summing up, going back to that informal and incidental learning model that I talked about before, and pointing out how the social context affects every single step of that cycle, so that tapping into how we can, in fact, bring the right people together in order to help folks at each step of that cycle of paying attention to jolts, consulting with others about the challenge and about solutions, paying attention to what goes wrong or goes right after we put solutions in place, and then rethinking what that might mean for our work going forward.
Thank you. There has been so much collected and connected learning. We wish we can still go on. We're extending this by another 5 minutes, and this is your last opportunities. Participants, quickly put up your hands if you have something else to contribute. Yes, Chandru, Robert, shoot, as fast as you can.
Hello, can you hear me?
Chandru, we can hear you.
Okay. Victoria, thanks. There are two observations, and it could lead to a question as well, which is where I think I'm seeing transition. One is more like Facebook versus face-to-face. What do I mean? This challenge that the corporate world is having today is some of us are looking at, or many global organizations looking at, taking their learning spend and translating into 70% e-learning and 30% classroom. Now, it seems to be a fad now to make that as an e-learning culture. On the other hand, I'm also facing a dilemma where organizations will benefit by face-to-face as well. So one seems to cater to Generation Y and the other seems to cater to the Generation X. And I see a huge conflict, friction, transition that is taking place. Can you throw some light on what is the ideal balance between the two so we don't lose touch the way we are doing in terms of learning?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I'd make millions of dollars, Chandu. I think it is also something that is quite not only important to tailor it to your organization, but it's also something that needs to be taken into consideration with different functional backgrounds. For example, engineers, you would think that engineers would really take to technology, internet kinds of learning and social learning, etc. And they do to a point, but they also have to be sure that the source of that learning is somebody who they respect and whose judgment they really believe in. And so there have been many studies of engineers that prefer to share learning face-to-face because of the many differences that exist in the kinds of work that they have to do, and that's they have to trust that the person that they're working with really is what they think is a credible source for the work that they're doing. So I wish I did have an easy formula for you, but I think I think it varies to some extent with the culture of the people in your organization. And just one other idea, Edgar Schein, the big organizational culture guru, I met him at a meeting recently, and he was talking about how challenging it is for many of the people who use mostly technology to have the skills that they need to work effectively face-to-face in ways that older generations actually learned how to do. So it could be that some of that face-to-face interactive kinds of things are things that we need to help those who use a lot of technology also get more skill in.
And very quickly, any last contributions?
Victoria, good morning.
Good morning, Robert.
Hi. Just a comment rather than a question. I think for the group is that, in team learning, we normally have our team members who are part of the organization, and therefore they may feel that they are being accessed all the time, even asking the right questions or responding to the answers to the question. That's why we need to encourage our people, our leaders, even our staff to actually join other companies forming small COP groups, community of practices, where in their discussion group, they do not feel they're being accessed. They feel that they're there as an important contributor, as a member, and therefore they are more free to share their thoughts, and in doing so, also harness the thoughts of others and grow the group, just like you mentioned, Victoria. That's what we do at Harvard, where we tap onto each other's expertise and areas, and we share it, and we don't feel we are confined or we are answering to our organization in our actions and thoughts, but we are just learning from each other. So I would encourage the group that, encourage your people to form intercompany COPs or join organization like STADA, or even webinar like that, where you are free to just share what you want in your mind, and you are not being assessed or noted down for a bad questions or a bad answer. Yeah, so that's my little statement on that, Victoria.
That's great, Robert.
We have to bring this session to a close. We want to thank Victoria, all our distinguished participants for making this session so useful. To all our viewers, thank you so much for being with us for this wonderful collective learning experience. This has been a fast and furious flow of collective learning. It remains for each one of us to be mindful of what George Bernard Shaw once said: progress is impossible without change, And those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And to borrow the words of Victoria and her husband in one of their publications, individuals who learn create organizations that learn. We do hope that these 60 minutes will so inspire you to pledge to be learning individuals who will choose to create environments that encourage others to learn together collectively. With that, this is Sally Chu, your moderator, signing off from the Glocal Connect Village, that connecting place at Temasek Polytechnic.